Welcome to our podcast. This is Friends on Fire.
I'm Mike. I'm a lifelong devotee of financial independence. I even wrote a book about it.
And I'm Maggie, a newer convert, but just as passionate, especially on the intersection of minimalism and financial independence.
We're one and the same.
We are two like-minded friends who believe that talking about money with your friends and family opens the door to financial well-being.
The Friends on Fire podcast is about dispelling myths, building financial acumen, and sharing your financial independence journey with the people you care about.
This is Friends on Fire.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Maggie. How you doing?
I'm good. Just got back from the Dollar Tree.
Oh, I love the Dollar Tree.
I was actually thinking about you and your wife when I left the Dollar Tree because I was like so tickled, which is a great word, by the way. I was so tickled with myself.
At the I thought you were like somebody tickled you at the Dollar Tree,
no,
which would not surprise me. Sometimes there are some weird people there.
That's super inappropriate, especially during COVID times. No one should ever be tickling me in a retail store that I don't know, but especially during COVID, makes me think of the Go Blue, right, where I'm like, you don't want anyone to go blue you anytime, but especially during a global pandemic. No, I was walking out of the Dollar Tree and I was proud of myself for going, first off, because my daughter really wanted, they're into this like makeup thing right now. And she messed up her older sister's lipstick and she was like, really wanted to replace it for her as a surprise. And so I was like, okay, I like where you're going with this. It's a very nice and thoughtful thing to do. So like, we'll go. And my husband was like, this is a long story. Anyways, my husband was like, oh, that's so nice that she wants to do something nice for her sister. And I was like, you mean nice that she wants to do something nice that involves my time and money? I guess so. You know, like she's not doing any of the work, but it was a nice thought. But anyways, so we go there. And one of my kids needed a calculator for their math class at school. And I tried to give her my business school, like BA2 like calculator, whatever it's called. What do you call it? Like scientific calculator.
Yeah. And
I think it was like more than she needed. It has like way too many buttons. And like, I think she just needs a basic calculator. And so I'm like, I'm kind of cheap in areas like that. Like I'm like, well, we have a functioning calculator. I don't want to buy another one. I just, like I'm kind of frugal. I don't want to buy something that I don't know my point.
Where the hell is this story going,
Hold on.
Maggie?
You can take this whole section out, by the way, including you saying that. So I'm kind of frugal and I just don't think to shop at the Dollar Tree. But I remember when you and I were first comparing budgets, I would see like $50 a month or $60 a month of like multiple purchases of yours at the Dollar Tree. And I was always like, what are you buying at the Dollar Tree? And there's one super close to my house, like in my neighborhood practically. And I just never think to go there. And I was just talking to my husband the other night and I was like, we should really go there more often and like try to get something there first before we go somewhere else. Cause they have some amazing deals. Like your wife actually commented on something on Instagram where something about dry erase boards. And I had said that we bought some at Amazon and she was like, Dollar Tree has them. And I was like, oh my God, I paid $20 for 6, which was not $1 each. And she's telling me that they're available at the Dollar Tree. So I'm like, there's just a lot of things there. And I don't think to go there first. And so I was really proud of myself because my daughter wanted this lipstick thing. And I was like, but I'm going to see if they have a calculator because otherwise I'd spend like, I don't know, $5 or $10 on a calculator at Amazon or at Target. They had calculators perfectly fine. They had a fairly large selection and it was $1. And they had a couple other things that the kids needed for school also. And I had just been to Target last week getting school supplies and it was like everything was just so much cheaper.
That's amazing. I'm glad you've now realized this. And although we didn't plan this, I am going to come back to your Dollar Tree experience during our conversation today because it definitely applies to one of our key messages. So we're going to be talking about budgeting and versus tracking, the differences, and compare and contrast them, talk about the pros and the cons.
This topic came up for us recently. I think we're actually, I first thought of it when we were having a discussion with the Frugal Friends who run a podcast and we interviewed them and they were talking so much about budgeting. And I was like, I don't really budget. I just track my expenses pretty meticulously. And so do you. And it's a very different approach than budgeting. And it just made me think, like what are the differences? And they're kind of different ends of the same spectrum. And that it's worth talking through, like you said, the pros and cons, considerations for both, and kind of, deciding what is the best approach for you personally and thinking through that more thoughtfully.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we both track. We don't budget per se. And that is really the result of us trying to be as efficient as possible and continuously improve. And so both of these methods have benefits, but we'd like to try to talk about how they are different and how you should choose one or the other or both in some cases.
Yeah, because I think your lifestyle choices and sort of where you're at in your life, also the stage you're at in your life, could dictate which makes the most sense for you, whether budgeting is really needed or not, and where you're going to get the most bang for your specific buck.
So as we get into the descriptions of these, one key thing to call out is that if you're budgeting, then you're already tracking, but it doesn't work the other way around. And so you could decide only to track and not set a specific budget. Budgeting is when you are setting a limit, a spending limit for certain categories of expenses for a time period. And so this is typically based on your income, but it could also be for like one-offs or specials. And so, for example, you say, I want to spend $400 on groceries for the month. That is my budget. I'm not going to go over that. And ideally, you would take all of your income and then break it up into your quote unquote budgets for your different categories of expenses.
Including budgets for like savings goals, even, not just expenses.
Yeah,
which is important.
Exactly.
What do you think are some of the pros for the importance of budgeting?
So let me first say that I have never been a fan of budgeting.
Well, then maybe I should cover the pros and you should cover the cons.
Well, I think it would be fair for me to discuss the pros, but I want to highlight why I'm very much against budgeting. And it's because budgets help you develop discipline when you're lacking it. And I pride myself on my discipline. When I give people advice, I focus on developing discipline. And so I don't find a lot of value in budgets, but as we were planning for this episode and we were breaking down the benefits of each, we really did kind of narrow in on the fact that budgeting does provide a lot of value for people in developing that discipline.
Yeah, I think discipline is a great word here. And we've talked about it before, you were like the king of discipline. I don't know if I've ever met someone as disciplined as you are. And you also love fine print, but you don't love budgeting. It's like I'm learning so much about you, But one of the big pros, like you said, is this helps you create discipline to get to your goals. And if you are and this again is why you need to kind of be introspective here and self-aware. If you have issues with discipline and that's an area where you can improve more, you might really benefit from setting a budget because you need to put boundaries on yourself and you need to set some things to improve your discipline in this area.
The other pro is that it can help you alleviate some of the guilt with spending that you might be facing if things are very tough. If you go through the exercise of taking your income and breaking it out into what you can afford, then it gives you a little bit of flexibility to spend that amount and not feel bad about it if you otherwise would feel bad about it. Now, this brings us to the first con, though, that if you set a budget for something, like, let's be honest, you are always going to be right at it or right over it. No one ever sets a budget of $400 and then spends $50, right?
Well, it's back to the discipline. This is probably one of my biggest kind of pet peeves or concerns with budgeting versus expense tracking, is that it does sort of give you permission to spend on things that you might not actually really even need or want, but you want to treat yourself because you're well, I'm below budget. And so I've heard people say well, I went and bought XYZ clothing because I had budgeted $100 for clothing this month. So it's fine. I was able to do that. And you're but did you need the clothing? Or did you just do it because at some point when you were trying to think ahead, you thought, well, I'm going to budget for clothing. But if no actual needs arise for clothing, like we're in a global pandemic and you might not need a lot of new clothing, then you now all of a sudden feel the permission, unnecessary permission to go spend on something versus just appreciating how little you've spent on clothing. And so that's why when we switch to expense tracking, it's almost like a zero-based budget of you're trying to spend as little as possible, and you're never feeling like you have to spend up to a target, which is, again, my biggest thing. That's like the number one reason to me why I would, not that I'm anti-budget, but that I am pro expense tracking is the most important thing. And I'm like, look, if you want to layer a budget on it and you have some discipline around how you think about needs versus wants, which I also want to do a whole episode on, then I think budgeting can be a great tool.
The second con, and Maggie, you kind of touched on this a little bit, is that while budgeting helps create discipline, it doesn't by itself drive better performance. So like I think about what happens at work, with me and you and your team. Like we set budgets to make sure that we don't overspend and we manage our resources. But then a lot of people come in and be like, well, I have this new contract, this new vendor, and it's within budget. I'm like, yeah, but is there a return on investment? Do we still need to pay money for this? Can we do it any better? Just because we have money available in our quote unquote budget doesn't mean we need to spend it. And so if you want to continually improve, budgeting by itself is not going to do that for you. And that's the big con. I think that's what you and I are both really focused on here.
Yeah. And con is even a strong word here because nobody's ever going to say setting a budget is bad, right? So it's more of just like considerations and things you want to think through and kind of go in eyes wide open on. Okay. So speaking of that, let's talk about sort of budgeting is a good method if, right? Scenarios where you would want to make sure that you are coming from the budgeting angle in addition to expense tracking.
So the first one is if you know you lack discipline in this area and you need to establish boundaries with your spending, budgeting will help you do that.
I think the next one is if you're on a fixed income and you just only have so much you can spend because you don't want to go into debt and you don't want to spend more than you make, budgeting can be incredibly important because you're looking at a grocery bill and saying, I only have $400 this month. I'm going to do whatever it takes to stretch things out and to only hit that number, right? So I think being on a fixed income, and fixed income might be, the wrong term for some people, Mike, but being on a limited income, right? Where you really are trying to make sure that you spend within a certain amount in order to reach your savings goals, et cetera, can be very important.
So what are some tools people can use to set a budget?
So there's so many tools in this space, and I'm not even going to fully do justice to all the different things you can do here, but some that I'm familiar with off the top of my head there's the Dave Ramsey envelope method, which is like a cash. Do you know about this method, Mike?
Yeah, like you actually put cash in envelopes and that's your budget.
Yeah, and you spend out of those for the month. And I think the combination of the envelopes and the cash is a very physical system for some people that helps versus a lot of money is digital these days and you don't touch it and feel it and realize when it's leaving your hands because it's all on credit cards and apps and other things. Another one that I know many of our listeners are big fans of is YNAB, which stands for You Need a Budget. And it's a budgeting app that it is a pretty sweet interface. It's a paid app.
And then, of course, like the big ones, Mint and Personal Capital have free apps, which will help you establish budgets.
Yeah. And the pros for that one, for those two, obviously, are that they're free. Mike, what is your view? I just looked up the cost of YNAB because I couldn't remember it. Again, it's a pretty slick app. It stands for You Need a Budget, which is the YNAB, which is why I'm saying YNAB. It's a funny word. Its monthly costs $11.99 a month. You can cancel anytime, or it's $84 a year. What is your view on spending money for a budgeting app like that? Just curious. This is like a rhetorical question. I could answer this question
I don't know
you.
why you're asking me this. You're just going to make me offend people. So you should definitely not spend money on this stuff. Not only should you just be mindful of what you're spending money on, and this is probably something you can avoid, but the way you grow and improve your control and understanding of personal finance is to practice it. It means opening up Excel, writing things down on a piece of paper, looking at your paycheck, looking at your receipts. So the more you take yourself out of the process, the further away from really mastering this you become. So don't spend money on this. Do it yourself. That is the best way to do it, and it's free.
Yeah. I will say on the flip side of that, first off, I agree with your approach of I am so frugal. I will rarely spend money on things. I will rarely spend money to like save money because I think I can just save money to save money. But I know one of our biggest fans, Mike, who you and I both work with, uses YNAB and is a big fan of it. And I would never critique that expense because it really helps her. And so that $84 a year really helps her. And there's way worse things you could spend your money on. So you have a very, like you said, super disciplined manual view to many things, Mike. But if that app makes you happy and it's easy to use and it really gets you on track, like don't lose any sleep over the fact that you're going to pay for something would be my recommendation or thoughts on it.
If your goal is to get on track and to develop discipline, then for a certain period of time, it probably makes a lot of sense. However, as an ongoing expense, I would recommend everybody try to develop a free way to do this, because if you haven't yet developed discipline after paying for something for years and years, I think you need to ask yourself, what are your goals? Do you really want to improve, or are you just kind of coasting along?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I wasn't suggesting that you pay for it for decades. I was more saying, at a point in time, it could be helpful. So that's a great point. Okay, let's switch over to tracking expenses.
We are super passionate about this. And another plug for our new Etsy store, we developed an expense tracking worksheet, which allows you to stay very connected with all these expenses, as I was just mentioning. You have to enter all this stuff manually, but then gives you a lot of interesting pieces of information which will let you manage your expenses. And I think after we review this section of the show, everyone will see a lot of benefit in this approach, and I would encourage everybody to go to that store and pick up that file because it's pretty cool. We've gotten a lot of great feedback on it.
We also did a whole episode specifically on expense tracking. So if you want a little bit more of an in-depth coverage on that, it's episode number 15 and it's called Expense Tracking Gone Wild, and really digs into the details of expense tracking, which it's called Gone Wild because Michael loves talking about this topic.
Oh man, can't get enough of it. So expense tracking is cataloging every single expense you have, reviewing it regularly, and then here's the key point, changing your spending habits because of it.
Yeah. So this was like the story I told last episode about my friend, and she started logging all of her expenses and seeing how much she was spending on groceries and was kind of surprised by the amount, right? It was a really big amount. And it was not just surprised by her amount. She was surprised to hear it compared to other people's, which I think is often the next level of tracking your expenses is start to compare them to others.
When you are tracking expenses, it's something that you should do regularly every month so that you can look at what you are spending on all your normal categories and see if they're changing. And so Maggie, you and I have a lot of fun when we review our expenses together, and I can ask you, like, what the hell were you doing? You spent $500 dining out one month when your average is $100. And that is the kind of conversations and the kind of thought process that you need to be having if you want to make improvements.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the pros of this approach. I mean, we could talk for hours about the pros of this approach, but we will try to limit it to a few key ones. This is the tool that establishes the framework for continuous improvement. So Maggie, you were talking about the Dollar Tree and how you now found that all of these normal things cost $1 and they're perfectly usable.
It's still shocking to me, by the way.
And so you might have gone to Best Buy to buy, let's say, that whiteboard originally and spent $25.
Why would I go to Best Buy to buy a whiteboard?
Just let me finish my example. Like maybe 10 years ago, you've been like, I don't know.
Right.
What's a store
Amazon.
that sells whiteboards?
I went to Amazon.
No. Well, no, here.
Oh, you need a real store. I would have gone to Target to buy a whiteboard.
So you might have gone to Target a few years ago and bought a whiteboard for $15. And then you've made some improvements in your purchase habits. And now you go to Amazon, you find a better deal and it's $10. You have now taken a step further and you've now gone to the Dollar Tree and you found it for $1.
And then I discovered the Dollar Tree.
So this is the type of thing that you should be doing with all of your spending. And expense tracking is what allows you to do that very easily for all of your normal expenses.
By the way, when I was at the Dollar Tree looking at the calculators, I was so shocked that they had calculators. They even had a little mini scientific one that I turned it on, which you could do through the package. And I started putting in some real math problems because I was like, does this really work for $1?
Is it like a gimmick?
It was correct. I wanted to make sure the math was right. It was so cheap.
The other great pro is that it allows you to create a record of your expenses going back for a period of time so you could do research and comparison and see things. I have been tracking every single expense since 2014. And so I can go back and tell you, like, when did you go pay this amount? Like, we were talking about our property taxes the other day. I could go back and look at all of it, like when I paid it, how much it was, because I have all of these numbers and I can do nice charts. And this is the sort of stuff I love, Maggie.
I was yawning because you were talking about tracking expenses since 2014, but when we get to the cons, we'll talk about how tedious it is. So, yeah, the other thing which we mentioned briefly earlier is it really does make a great tool for having comparison discussions with other people. And we've said this, so many times on this podcast. One of the purposes of this and the reason it's called Friends on Fire is talking to your friends and family about money can improve your money situation and take a topic that was once taboo and make it much more mainstream and approachable and create benefits for everybody. And so I've had really interesting discussions with friends and coworkers and others about how much I'm spending on certain things, from car insurance to groceries to all sorts of things. And until you track it and write it down and realize how much you might be spending on something and then start to compare it to somebody else, you don't really fully have a benchmark for like what's good or what's bad or what's normal and, what should I budget, et cetera. So I think that comparison piece is so important on the tracking.
And speaking of benchmarks, if you're interested in FIRE, like retiring early, you need to understand how much money you'll need, because you'll need money to cover your expenses, and you won't know what your expenses are unless you are tracking them. And so this is an important tool for people who want to achieve financial independence. You need to know where your money's going.
Yeah. And you might think like, oh, I'm tracking my net worth. I'm going to see, how much money I made in a year. And so I'll know what I spend. But there's so many things in most people's expenses that are coming and going every month, of like different bills and paying people back and, something that came in for a trip and then everyone paid you back. Just all these complexities to your finances. And then you might have made money in the market. And there's so many reasons your net worth might, improve or go down that is very different than truly understanding what it costs a family of 4 or your family of 5 or whatever it might be to live in the average year. And that to me, to your point, Mike, has been fascinating as I've been more meticulously tracking my expenses since you and I started, or since I started doing it with you, I think like last September or October of 2019. It's been super helpful to kind of see like, what does it really cost us to live for a year? Because I couldn't have really told you that before. I really wasn't quite sure where some of my money was going.
Now, even though we love expense tracking, we should give a balanced view, talk about some of the cons. The first thing, and I think I probably suffer from this, maybe not so much you, but it makes it really hard to splurge when you are constantly measuring yourself against previous months and years.
Yeah.
If you're always looking for improvement, it's hard to deviate from that progression.
Yeah, no, I would say I suffer from this more than you do because you're so disciplined. I've gotten like, there's a few months where we got our eating out like below $100 a month. And I was so proud of myself. And then I'd get into a next month and I'd be like, oh, how do we get up to like 150 or 200, which is still very reasonable for us considering, how much we spend overall. But you start to sort of, it becomes like a zero sum game where you're constantly trying to spend as little as possible. And it's sort of like never enough. Mm-hmm. You're like, well, I could always spend less. What happens when I get to no eating out in a month? You know, and then I'm just sort of like not enjoying life as much as I'd like to. And so it can, you got to be careful and cautious on sort of how and why you're tracking expenses and, still enjoying your life and prioritizing what matters to you and making sure that you keep that angle.
Mm-hmm.
Man, the other con, which I don't think you suffer from so much, Mike, it can be super tedious and time consuming. And I have a little confession to make for you in this category.
Uh-oh.
Like I said earlier, I've been doing this more meticulously or very meticulously since I think September or October when you like challenged me to like track it for a month and then said we'd compare it at the end of the month. And so I've been doing it since then, but I've kind of fallen off the wagon in July and August. I've just been.
What?
I know. I'm sorry. I've been really busy. I'm going to get back on the wagon, right? Like I can still go back and do it. I have the data. It's not organized and categorized and stuff. And I keep saying to my husband, I'm like, I got to get back on it because I'm really the one that was doing it. And he would help with pieces of it of just categorizing stuff. But I'm just behind and then the more behind you get, the more you're like, oh, it's just like a lot more work to go back and like look through everything. And, cause I use Mint to then go kind of like manually categorize it and track it and clean it up, if you will.
Maggie, I just had a realization. If you don't track your expenses, you end up.
Did they really happen?
No.
Oh.
You end up losing all sense of your spending and go buy a $35,000 Subaru. This is what will happen to everybody. This is why.
That's when I was like, I don't want to have to log the Subaru, so I'm just going to quit expense tracking altogether. I'm just like, I give up. No, you're right. I haven't had to log that thing in there yet. It's going to be a painful one.
Ooh, yeah. Can't wait.
There should be a special category for that, where it's like depreciated over 10 years because I don't want it to hit me in 1 year.
You want to put it like below the line? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I want to put it below the line. Exactly.
All right. But you're right.
Okay.
It's tedious and time consuming. I really like that, and I've developed.
You love things that are tedious and time consuming.
Yes,
like, this sounds like a good time to me.
It is painful to do it at first, but once you get into a rhythm and once you see the benefit of it, you will soon start to appreciate the practice and, dare I say, find some enjoyment and satisfaction from it. All right. So the best use for this method is if, number one, budgeting hasn't really worked for you in the past, or you've just moved past it as far as your discipline is concerned.
It's also helpful if you just don't really know where your money is going, which I would have said for myself. Like I felt like I was pretty frugal, but there were just things where I really didn't have full line of sight and transparency into where my money was going. And I had enough money. So again, I wasn't as incentivized to like keep a budget because I wasn't on a limited budget. But I did have high savings goals. And so I wanted to know where my money was going, but I just didn't really know. And it's been incredibly helpful for that. And it's given me the tools to be able to have those comparative conversations with other people, which has really helped me in some big categories like insurance and some other things where I was just paying too much.
And if you have aggressive financial goals, this isn't just the best method. This is the only method that I would recommend in order to help you achieve those goals. So as far as what tools available to track your expenses, as we mentioned, we have this tracker, which we developed as a somewhat easy way to get into this practice. And so we think you really like it. But there's also, again, Mint and Personal Capital will allow you to do this as well.
Yeah. And you can, if you don't have access to Microsoft Excel, you can do it in Google Sheets, which is free to everybody. And there's some people that even do it on paper that, keep it in a notebook and add it up. And
God bless
it's possible. It's a thing.
So the two approaches, definitely for different types of situations and different types of people, both have value, both have some drawbacks. But if you're not doing either of them, we definitely encourage you to pick up one of these things immediately. 3 key takeaways, Maggie?
Okay, the number one is, like we said at the beginning, these are two different ends of a system or approach. They each have their own benefits. So think of them as a progression. You can move from budgeting to tracking as you establish more discipline. And you're going to need to do tracking regardless of whether you do budgeting or not, right? You can't really have, in that case, you can't have one without the other. But you could just be doing expense tracking and not really coming at it from a true budgeting angle, which is how Mike and I both operate personally.
Number 2, budgeting is easy, but the results are mixed. And I don't mean the emotional aspect of setting a budget. I just mean mechanically setting a budget and tracking to it is very easy. Tracking expenses is very hard, but the potential is huge.
I should clarify too, Mike, when you say setting a budget is easy, that's because it's easy for you. It's not an easy emotional thing for many people.
That's why I said
Right?
I'm not talking about the emotional part. I said the mechanical aspect of budgeting is quite easy. You got to listen to me when I'm talking
No. I actually heard you say that. I still think the mechanical aspect for some people is not easy. You are so financially focused and like that is in your DNA. There's a lot of people where like the numbers of all this, like it's just not second nature to them and it kind of stresses them out. I've encountered many of those people. And so I say it is mechanically easy to you because you could do this stuff in your sleep, but it takes a little bit more work. It's not how people's brains are wired. Number 3, whatever you decide, the most important thing is to just understand where your money is going. So until you establish some sort of a method to improve your spending, the chances are it's not going to get better because what gets measured gets better.
Oh yeah, it's our saying.
And everything around us is designed to incentivize you and convince you to spend money and buy things that you do not need or really even want. It is shocking. And I work in marketing. It's the one thing I don't like about working in marketing. I work in marketing for a travel company and I believe that travel is good for people. It's the only way I can sleep at night. I legitimately could not work in marketing for many companies, Mike, because I don't believe people need more of many types of products. And I don't want to hawk a product that I think people don't need. And I think that's the one thing that is still so difficult is just that you are constantly bombarded with advertising and marketing to try to convince you. And it's hard to resist. You know, those Instagram ads, they're pretty well targeted and they're like, you're like, I think I need that. That is going to make me happy. That is going to make my life better. Okay, we're getting off on a tangent. Should we do a quick Mike's Minute on the mic?
All right, sure. You got a question for me?
I got a good question for you.
All
okay,
right.
You stated that you have been doing detailed expense tracking since 2014.
Mm-hmm.
This is a 2-part question. How old were you in 2014?
That's
not hard math. Come on.
6 years ago, so 31.
What were you doing before then, and why did it take you until the age of 31 to start tracking your expenses?
Because I spent so little money. I mean, you couldn't believe it. So this was before
Were you single then?
No. So this was before we had our first child. We had just moved into a house like a year and a half prior. And so we were just getting into kind of like real life expenses. Before then we were renting. We didn't really like have a lot of stuff or a lot of space. We didn't have kids. Like our spending was so efficient. There was no reason to. Plus it was just, I have been on a constant evolution. You know, I've been on this fire journey forever. And so my goal is just to be constantly improving. And so at some point I decided this is the next thing I need to do if I want to make a big change in my spending. And I'm going to try it out. And I liked it so much that I continued it in 2015 and 16 and now into 2020.
Very helpful. I was just curious because you've been doing some of this stuff for so long. And I always joke that you came out of the womb thinking about this stuff. But then I was like, only since 2014? It was a little surprising.
Oh, did I let you down on this?
Yeah, a little. It was less that you let me down. It was more that I was just disappointed. I'm just kidding.
Oh, that's my line for you.
I know. That's what I tell my kids. I'm like, no, it's just that I'm disappointed. No, it was more that I was just curious, like what prompted it to begin in 2014. So I get it. That's kind of when, more life stuff started hitting you and created a need for it. Okay. I hope this discussion was helpful to people. Some fairly simple topics around budgeting versus tracking, but
important
at the
ones.
Same time, but very important. And just, very different angles. Cause again, I'm kind of intrigued. Like we talk a lot about tracking expenses and we don't talk as much about budgeting, primarily because just for us at our life stage, it's not the focus for us. But like we said, it can be, incredibly important and meaningful depending on the type of person you are and when you need it and just the life stage you're at.
So thanks everybody for listening. If you've been challenged or inspired by what you heard, please rate and review the show. It helps other people find our show. You can also subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. If you have thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you, and you can leave us a voicemail or text us at 404-981-3370 or hit us up on Instagram or Facebook.
Awesome. Well, great discussion, Mike. Have a good night.
Thanks, Maggie.
Bye.
Bye.